Attention, everybody. The views and opinions expressed on the show are not necessarily those of Acts Ministry, Acts Media Group, and or their affiliate and supported ministries and or nonprofits. Here they are today to talk about the bucket list on the topic for today, income tax. What you need to know. Take it away, Dr. Paul.
Yeah. Well, hello, world, wherever you are. And if you live in a part of the world where you don't have an income tax, count yourself blessed. Anyway, I'm here with Nancy, my beloved, and we're going to talk about the income tax, the history of it a little bit. Interesting that last evening, Fox News had an hour-long special on the history, the unauthorized history of the income tax. But just by coincidence, I had announced this topic a week ago, so maybe they picked up on it and got the idea from me. Maybe, it's possible. They got to get their ideas from someplace. Anyway, I want to say hello to all of our friends everywhere. We're not going to name you person by person. You know who you are. Been calling your name on the broadcast for 2, 3, 4 years now on the old happy hour. This is the bucket list, and on the bucket list we deal with matters that should definitely be of interest to people 50 and beyond, and those who have family members who are 50 or beyond. These are pertinent topics. And also a reminder that there's a new program lineup on Acts Media Group now, and Acts is always spelled A-C-T-S, Acts Media Group. And that new lineup, you can find them on actsmediagroup.com and so forth. Good lineup of new shows, and some of them just retitled, but new schedule. It's worth your time to take a look. And while you're at it on the Acts Media Group website, find that little donate button and push the button and put a little something into the till. It would be very helpful. Anyway, I want to give some news before we get into the income tax situation. I get a lot of news on this little gadget right here. I call it my stupid smartphone. And I get more than this on the 2 computers that are on my desk in my writing room at home, our writing room. Anyway, this morning at 9:27, the news came in now, this Central Daylight Time, that President Biden has nominated the police chief of Tucson, Arizona, to run the Customs and Border Protection Agency. And it's created a little bit of a stir because Tucson is a sanctuary city. And some people feel that's kind of like having the fox guarding the hen house, or vice versa, no fox guarding the hen house, nobody guarding the hen house. Anyway, that's in the news. Locally, a car parked near a major shopping center right here in Springburg, USA, had its catalytic converter stolen. That's getting to be quite the thing now. Catalytic converters being stolen from parked cars, some of them in broad daylight. What a world, huh? What a world. I also get news every day from the Federal Reserve Board. I get where they're accepting applications for various committees, and then I get a notification here at where they just appointed a new member to the Financial Technological Advisory Group. I get information from the Internal Revenue Service in the news. I have IRS tax tips that came in at 8:58 or 8:55 this morning. So they try to keep us up on things. And then at 8:06 this morning, the news: violent riots rock Minneapolis again over that officer involved, etc. People know about all that case. So a lot of news, and there were protests in Brooklyn Center, Michigan, etc. So that's some of the news, and we reached a point, Nancy, where it's probably very true that no news would be good news. because all the news seems to be bad to worse, and that's just the way of the world. So let's get into the history of the federal income tax a little bit. The information that I have has come from a rather liberal source where they are kind of kind toward the Internal Revenue Service, the federal government, and programs. Contrary to another side of the income tax issue where you have folks who still are convinced that it's not constitutional to have an income tax and they are opposed to it, etc., and not at all in favor of government spending and government spending patterns. So, but this happens to be a source that's friendly to the Internal Revenue Service and friendly toward the income tax and friendly toward government expenditures. The money raised through the income tax, they say, is used to pay for the programs and benefits, and they underline benefits.
Of who?
Yeah, to whose benefit? For the benefit of the people, it says. Essential services such as national defense, so I go along with that. Food safety inspections. Yes, I remember that. When I was a pastor in St. Joseph, Missouri back in the early 60s, several members of my church were involved with the meatpacking industry, and some of them were government inspectors, and to make certain that the food supply is safe. There's a book that was written, a novel, a Christian novel by a Christian novelist out in Ransom Canyon, Texas, Lyle Way. The name of the book is The Edge of Disaster, and it tells the intriguing tale of a man who was a college professor in a Middle Eastern country who was raised, he didn't do it himself, but he was raised up to a position of leadership, and he had a plan to bring down the United States of America by sabotaging the food supply. And that plan would work, but that's the reason why we have food safety inspections. Then there are federal benefit programs. Now this one, some folks disagree with, including Social Security. Social Security is something people paid into. It is not a benefit, it is a retirement program that the federal government has been taking money out of as fast as it goes into it for many years, so-called borrowing from the Social Security Trust Fund. But they say that income tax supports the Social Security. No, income tax doesn't. That's a separate tax. It's called FICA, F-I-C-A, Federal Insurance Corporate Action or something or other. Anyway, you pay Social Security tax, which is not the same as income tax. Please know that. While the federal income tax did not become permanent until 1913, during a Democrat president, by the way, taxes in some form have been a part of American history since our earliest days as a nation. So how did it come about? Here's some of the evolution of taxes. Taxes that were paid by the American colonists to Great Britain were one of the main reasons for the Declaration of Independence. It was a tax revolt. By the way, for those who don't believe that the federal income tax is constitutional, there was a great example of that a few years ago. An African-American heritage actor, action star, I mean, big-time action movies, Wesley Snipes. He went to federal prison for his failure to pay federal income tax because he wasn't trying to beat the government. He was, in his mind, he was trying to keep the government from beating him. He didn't believe that the income tax was constitutional. So there's been this discussion all the way along. Anyway, America's founding fathers knew that the young country that they were putting together would need some sort of taxes for essential items such as roads and especially defense. Now, I really don't think our founding fathers were thinking about roads back then. I mean, we're talking about horseback riding and ox carts. don't think they were considering taxes for roads. They were wanting to support people running the government monetarily. They wanted to support the buildings used to run the government, etc. In other words, the tax was primarily to run the government, secondarily to provide some amount of national defense. Providing the framework for taxation, they included procedures for the enactment of tax law legislation in the Constitution. Now, they didn't put it in there. They provided procedures for the future reference. Under Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution, all bills dealing with revenue and taxation must originate in the House of Representatives. That's still true today. And so the House of Representatives has a distinct role in that it's where all money bills have to originate, all money legislation has to originate. The Senate, it has a prescribed definite function, and that is to approve appointments and so forth. Otherwise, before the Constitution, before the final ratification of the Constitution in 1788, mind you, folks, we declared our independence in 1766. We did not have a Constitution until 1788. We're talking 12 years, 22 years later. No, 12 years later. The federal government, until then, lacked the direct power to raise revenue. So between 1776 and 1788, the government had no power to raise money or revenue directly. Under the Articles of Confederation, now remember that, Nancy, Confederation, money to pay the national debt was paid by the states in proportion to their wealth and at their discretion. Now remember, we started out as a confederacy. Interesting, isn't it? Because years later, we have some states that pull away to form a confederacy, and we have the Civil War. Originally, the colonies became a confederacy, and under that form of government, there was no personal income tax. It was left up to the states to decide at their discretion what they wanted to give to run the government, which was not a federal government, it was a confederate government. So one of the goals then of the Constitutional Convention was to ensure then that the federal government, when they got a federal government set up, not confederate, but federate government set up, that it had the power to levy taxes. So here we see it, folks. Confederacy is left up to the states to give to whatever kind of government's going to oversee several states. Federal means they have the power to directly tax the citizenry. There is a difference between a federal form and a confederate form of government.
Well, when you say Confederate, I think of the South. Then is federal the North?
That's right. And when the South broke away, because they didn't like a strong centralized government, they formed a confederacy, which is what this country was originally after being colonies. So we went from being colonies of Britain to being a confederacy to being a federal government, and then later the South split away for 4 years of war. So anyway, one of the goals of the Constitutional Convention to set up the federal government, one of the reasons they wanted a federal government was so that they had the power to levy taxes. That is one of the basic reasons for a federal government. Now, folks, I'm not a conspiracy guy. I pay my taxes. I've filed our taxes, etc. But we need to understand where this all came from. The difference between a confederacy and a federal government. And the federal government was set up by a handful of leaders, really, basically a handful of leaders, men, mind you, handful of old white men because they wanted the power to levy taxes directly. So the tax motive has been behind the motive for having a federal government. And the tax motive is to raise revenue. It's always, always, always about money. When I was teaching in a local college, one of the local colleges, I was teaching philosophy and ethics and psychology and history and all that stuff. In the ethics class, I would tell my students if they wanted to find the root cause or the first cause outside of theology of something in our social structure, our political structure, it was very simple. Follow the money. If you follow the money back, you find out the reason for a federal government is money. Now, if you take the dollar sign, if I had a board here I could show you, if you put up there on the board a U and overlap it with an S, you cut the bottom of the U off, you have US. That's a dollar sign.
Oh, that's right.
Mm-hmm, that's right. Now, do it yourself, folks, right now. Write down US like a dollar. Write down U with an S over it. Then erase the bottom of the U, and there you have the dollar sign. So money was the reason to have a federal government.
Oh, wow.
And
That's neat. I can see it in my mind if I can explain it right. You take that U on top of the S, that's like us.
Mm-hmm.
Then you take the bottom off of both, and
It's a dollar sign.
it's the dollar sign,
It's-
but the bottom fell out, you might say,
So we,
of us.
yeah. So
It comes out of us.
That's right. That's right. So anyway, now you can also understand one of the reasons for the Civil War. It was a dollar sign. It was money, one way or the other, on the side of the South or on the side of the North. It was money. I've been convinced for years that the root cause of every war, every conflict, you will find money, or whatever represents money. Now let's go on. Even after the ratification of the Constitution, which made us a federal government with the ability to levy taxes, most federal government revenues were generated through tariffs. Now, tariffs were government mandated. A tariff means taxes on imported products. So if back in those days, if England wanted to ship us something, then they had to pay there was a tariff charge, which went back to the cost of to whoever was shipping it. So you had import and export tariffs. If you wanted to send something out of the country, they charged you for it. You wanted to bring it in, they charged you for it.
So if you're getting something from China now, there's going to be a big tax.
Yeah, well, Donald Trump raised the taxes on Chinese imports.
And does that go back to China, meaning it hurts them?
Her costs are increased, and then as a result, though, they increase the cost of goods.
Yeah.
So it's still money.
Mm-hmm.
And so tariffs, they are levied by a federal government. You see, the government, in a sense, federal government owns the borders. A confederate government, the states own the borders. In the federal government, they own the border in a very real sense. So they will determine what it's going to cost to move stuff from out of the country into the country, from in the country to out of the country. Now, there's another one that they used called excise taxes, E-X-C-I-S-E, taxes on the sale or use of specific products or transactions. So if you were using something, they taxed you for using it. So it was on, or if you were selling something, they would tax you for selling it. State of Missouri has a sales tax. That's an excise tax. Excise taxes were considered regressive because people with lower incomes had to pay basically a higher percentage of their income to buy something. For instance, you have someone, we'll take round figures here, with a $10,000 a year income, and they're living in an area where there's a 10% sales tax, which that's a little high, about 7% sales tax. They pay the same tax as somebody with a $100,000 a year income. So it's called regressive. So that means that they pay a higher percentage of their income to buy something than the people on the upper end. That's easily understood. So excise taxes are not real popular with those who have a social conscience for lower income people. The most recognized federal excise taxes, now these are federal, that are still in existence today include taxes on motor fuels, tobacco, and alcohol. There are also excise taxes on activities such as gambling, tanning, bet you didn't know that, or the use of highways by commercial trucks. Have you ever noticed sometimes on the back of a big semi-trailer, this vehicle pays X number of dollars in taxes annually? Those are excise taxes. So, as is true with the modern income tax, those early taxes were far from popular among the people. Most people don't like taxes of any kind. But with the spirit of the American Revolution and independence still running high, some of the people took their dislike of taxes to a far higher level. Now, this is history. Between 1786 and 1799, there were 3 organized, get that word, organized rebellions. Now, these were not just mobs. They were organized rebellions. All of them, all 3 of them, were to protest various taxes. And they challenged the authority of the state and federal governments to generate needed revenue. The first one was called Shays' Rebellion, and it happened from 1786 to 1787, just a year. It was raised by a group of farmers in objection to what they considered the unfair methods used by state and local tax collectors. So they were opposed to the methods that were used. You can't just come in and take my crops. You better come and knock on my door and work out a deal. You can't just come in and take it. They wanted to give it more voluntarily. That was Shays' Rebellion, 1786, 1787. They were farmers. The next one was the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 in western Pennsylvania. It came in protest to what President George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Now here's the father of our country, has a Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. We're back, Washington's the first president, father of our country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's his Treasury Secretary who wrongly considered an innocuous excise tax upon spirits distilled within the United States and for appropriating the same. So the Whiskey Rebellion was in western Pennsylvania, and it was because of Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, taking it upon himself to issue a tax, an excise tax, upon spirits, that is whiskey and so forth.
Okay, so does that mean also that when you bought whiskey, you paid a tax?
That's right.
But then,
And when you sold it, you paid a tax.
yes, but then when you got a little drink of it, you paid a tax on it?
Well, no, in the saloons, you got a drink, no. But the saloon keeper paid a tax.
So you're talking about like 3 taxes on, say, 1 bottle?
It's very possible, sure.
Oh, my
And then not
goodness.
only that, but they could come and just take your whiskey. If you didn't pay the tax, then they'd come take the whole thing, and they didn't like that. By the way, speaking about saloons and a shot glass, the reason they call it a shot glass is because in the Old West days especially, people didn't have money to carry, but they would have converted silver or gold, whatever, into bullets. And a guy'd walk up to an old cowboy, walk up to the bar and put a bullet on the counter on the bar and say, "Give me a shot of whiskey." That one bullet would buy a little glass of whiskey. That was the reason they called it a shot of whiskey.
Oh,
Okay.
so then what in the world did they do with all those bullets that they got?
Then they would pass them off, trade them to a guy for gold or silver, a guy that needed bullets.
My goodness.
Yeah, or they'd trade them to some farmer for a side of beef or whatever, for a bunch of grain, because he needed bullets every now and then to defend his farm or his ranch. So that was the Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, here's the third one, Fries Rebellion, F-R-I-E-S.
Potato fries.
Fries Rebellion of 1799. Now, you notice all these have happened between 1786 and 1799. It was led by a group of Pennsylvania Dutch farmers. Now, I used to hear about the Pennsylvania Dutch when I was a kid. You don't hear much about that anymore, but Pennsylvania Dutch, they were, wonderful people, still are. They were opposed to a new federal government tax on houses, land, and enslaved people. Now, get this. While the farmers owned lots of land and houses, they were generally not slave owners, so they were not keen on paying taxes on something they didn't have. And so there was Fries Rebellion. Excuse me. Now, during the Civil War, remember, Confederate versus Federal, during the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, the federal government realized that tariffs and excise taxes, remember what they were, that alone could not generate enough revenue to both run the government and conduct the war against the Confederacy. In 1862, Congress established a limited income tax only on people who made more than $600 a year, which was a lot of money back then. But it was abolished in 1872 in favor of higher excise taxes on tobacco and alcohol. So that tax, that income tax on people making more than $600 a year was abolished 10 years later in favor of raising taxes on tobacco and alcohol sales and so forth. Congress reestablished an income tax in 1894, but the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. That's where guys like Wesley Snipes come into the play, because they say the court years ago declared it unconstitutional, therefore it is still unconstitutional. What has changed to make it constitutional? That's a good point. That's a good point. Is there anything constitutional about demanding that you pay something? Well, let the lawyers get in on this. Someday we'll have some folks come and work with this. By the way, you get an extension on your income tax this year by 1 month. Instead of April 15, it's like May 15. But just this morning, our CPA, beautiful, lovely, bright lady, called, and she's working on the IRS reports. They're not taxes, reports that have to be in by May 15 for 2 nonprofits that we operate. And those will be done and in the mail by the end of the week, because it's better to be early. It should have been done a month ago, but we've had coronavirus and stuff happening. Then she told me that also this week she would get our personal income tax done. And most people think that when you get to be almost 86 years old, like I am, that you no longer pay income tax. Well, that depends. It depends on income, and we don't have a lot of income, but if you have any kind of investment income at all, then you really have to file an income tax return. We can talk about that another time. But anyway, history of the income tax. 1894, the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional, and so the actor Wesley Snipes, he took it seriously and said it's unconstitutional. Now, in 1913, during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, the costs of World War I were coming up. He could see it coming, obviously, and they ratified the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, get this, permanently establishing the income tax.
Oh.
Now, that's why Wesley Snipes was convicted, because they came up with a constitutional amendment to ratify the income tax.
Well, how come that wasn't done in his first whatever, Wesley Snipes?
They probably didn't think, they probably thought they could just pass that first one and get away with it.
No.
That Congress could do it, but they found out they couldn't because the Supreme Court was the balance and said, no, you can't do it that way. If you're going to do it, you've got to do it by a constitutional amendment, which means a vote of the people, and at least 2/3 of the states have to ratify this amendment to the Constitution. So it takes it out of the hands of Congress and puts it in the hands of the people. And the people said they would do it. And here's what it states. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. So what it's saying in blank verse is this. The federal government, represented by the Congress, can determine and have power to determine what the tax is going to be and then collect those taxes on incomes, no matter where that money comes from, wherever you earn it. And they do not have to say, well, we can only take so much from this state and so much from that state. In other words, it's national. It's a national ability to levy and collect taxes. And that happened in 1913. Now, the 16th Amendment gave Congress the power to tax the incomes of all individuals and the profits of all businesses. And that's in the news now. President Biden wants to raise the corporate income tax from 21% to 28%. Some of his Democrat Party and perhaps some of the Republican Party are willing to compromise at 25%. There are those who are very critical of this move because they say corporations always find a way to not pay taxes anyway, and they will just pass any cost on to the consumer. Eventually, it comes down to the bottom line, or the people on the bottom. They're going to be paying the taxes. Now, in connection with that, let me point out something that I pointed out before on the old Happy Hour show. In the United States, the top 1% of the income earners pay 38% of the taxes already. Top 5% of the income earners pay 59% of the taxes. Now, here we're not talking about XYZ Corporation, but we're talking about the chief executive officer of XYZ Corporation, the guy that's on a salary, has his stock options. We had some here in Springburg, USA, I read about in our business journal. Their compensation last year was in some of them in the multi-millions of dollars locally. That's why you have some big, fine homes here in Springfield. And it's that way all across the country. But there were others that got a measly $1.5 million or $1.75 million, you know, in compensation.
I'll take their measly.
Yes. And then you be willing to pay the tax on it. So the top 1% of those we're not talking corporations here. We're talking individuals. 38% of the taxes. Top 5%, 59% of the taxes. Top 10%, and this gets up there to include a lot of people. A lot of people making $250,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year. Lots of people paying. They're paying 70% of the taxes. The top 25%, which includes even more people, that are not necessarily rich by today's standards or wealthy by today's standards, but very well-to-do, they're paying 86% of the taxes. So when you're driving around through the neighborhoods of Springburg, USA, you see a really fine home, be thankful, because somebody living in that house is probably helping to pick up the tab on the expenses of running this very expensive nation that we call the United States of America. And how did it get expensive? We'll deal with that in future programs. But by 1918, government revenue generated from the income tax exceeded $1 billion for the first time and topped $5 billion by 1920. And we're talking a chunk of change. This is back here over 100 years ago. The introduction of the mandatory withholding tax on employee wages in 1943 increased tax revenue to almost $45 billion by 1945. Now, you see, up until this time, there had been no mandatory withholding. The employer didn't hold out on the employee. In other words, the employer wasn't having to do the bookwork and the paperwork for the federal government. Well, the man who introduced this idea of mandatory withholding later regretted it, because he said it set the stage for a lot of abuse, and it set the stage for the enlargement of the federal bureaucracy in order, even though they made the employer responsible for the withholding of the tax, it put a lot of responsibility more on the bureaucracy to manage those who were doing the managing. So this bureaucracy called the Internal Revenue Service was getting out of control, and he called it his responsibility, because he said if he had not pushed through mandatory withholding, that wouldn't have happened. Right now, the IRS is a huge, very monolithic part of government. Even the politicians find it hard to tell the IRS what to do. The Internal Revenue Service is a very strong bureaucracy within the federal government. And I have no fault, no complaint with them, but I recognize, and they recognize, that they are a very large, powerful institution. Some of the best help we received from a lady who happened to be a committed Christian who worked for the IRS. And I had her, she came to one of our services more than once and had me lay hands on her and pray for her and her husband. And one time she was taking a trip out west, and she called me on my cell phone from her cell phone for me to pray for the people, members of her family that she was going to see who needed prayer. And so we've had good experiences, but the IRS is big, and even politicians can't really tell them what to do.
No, but the Holy Spirit can.
That's right. So he's the one you depend on.
That's right.
Okay, in 2010, the IRS collected nearly 1.2 trillion, that's with a T, $trillion through income tax on individuals, and another, get this, 226 billion from corporations. So corporations did pay some taxes. This was in 2010, and that's been 11 years ago. So what is the role of Congress in taxation? According to the U.S. Treasury Department, the goal of Congress in enacting tax-related legislation is to balance the need to raise revenue, the desire to be fair to taxpayers, and the desire to influence the way taxpayers save and spend their money. Folks, we know that the role of Congress in regard to taxation now has been very colored and distorted and moved and shifted because of social issues. Congress is reacting rather than acting. They're reacting to demonstrations. They're reacting to opinion pieces in newspapers. They're reacting to disinformation and misinformation. So right now, the role of Congress is such that there are many people who say that they have no confidence in Congress. And I can understand why. There are a few congresspersons that are heard on national news programs, but most are not heard. Most people have no idea what their congressman or congresswoman is actually doing in Washington, D.C., if anything. So the role of Congress in regard to taxation is very minimal. Back many years ago when I was doing work in Jefferson City, I knew how to get things done. Go see a state representative because they were close to the people, and you could get more done through a state rep than you could a state senator. Mm-hmm. That is and it used to be also that if 22 people wrote individual letters, signed letters, to a congressperson concerning an issue, and 22 of the letters that came in agreed that congressperson voted that way out of their entire congressional district. 22 letters. That was a fact. 22 letters from 22 separate people on an issue saying, we want you to vote for this. Congressperson did it. No matter what they had said before that, they did it. If they want you to vote against it, congressperson did it, no matter what they said before. Well, we're down to about 4 minutes. So, income tax today, the reality and controversy. As envisioned in 1913, the modern United States income tax is designed to be a progressive tax system, not regressive like excise taxes and tariffs, excise taxes especially, but to be progressive, meaning that higher income earners should pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes than lower income earners. According to the IRS, well, I've already given you those figures. Despite its progressive payment design, the modern income tax system is often accused of increasing income inequality. That's another whole issue to deal with. Here's what I believe is important for me to cover right now, Nancy, to skip away, because there's never enough time to go as deeply as we would like to. Tax brackets that for now, based on tax brackets in 2020, if you're filing taxes now. Get this. In the American tax system, income taxes are graduated, so you pay different rates on different amounts of taxable income called tax brackets. Mm-hmm. The more you make, the more you pay. For example, a single taxpayer will pay 10% on taxable income up to $9,875 earned. So when they figure your taxes and you get your deductions and you have extra above that, mm-hmm. you're going to pay 10% if it's up to $9,875. The top tax rate is 37% for taxable income above $518,400. I have the brackets right here. You can print them offline. So you've got in 2021. Now in 2020, which we're still with, 2020, it's 12% for incomes over $9,875. 22% for incomes over $40,125. 24% for incomes over $85,525. Now that would be $171,050 for married couples filing jointly. Well, there's a lot of married couples who will make that kind of money. You can drop down to even 22%. Married couples, $80,250. That takes in a lot of people who are really the working poor these days. Mm-hmm. $40,000 each by the time they do the withholdings and all that. That's not a lot of money by today's standards. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about it. If you make $20 an hour, 40-hour week, that's $800 a week. That's $40,000 plus a little bit a year. But when they start withholding, what are you going to do with that? I mean, take a look, folks. Go online and check these brackets for yourselves. If you're up there in that upper bracket where between you and your wife you're earning or receiving $622,050, you're going to be taxed 37% of that. The government's going to take 37% of that. That's over a third of it. Think about it. over a third of it. So I think, Nancy, we'll probably need to continue next week with our talk about taxes and tax rates, and we will also then move it into Social Security. And those of you who think you're too young, that this isn't relevant to you, yes, it is. You'll find out. For instance, let me tell you, yesterday I was 40 years old. Guess how old you're going to be tomorrow? Goes like that. Because every year you put it off, it's easier to put it off and put it off and put it off. And all of a sudden, you're behind the 8 ball. You better be listening to old Dr. Paul and sweet little Miss Nancy, because we're going to be telling you things not only good for those 50 and above, but those of you who one of these days will be 50, and you need to know about income tax, Internal Revenue Service, Social Security, Medicare. You need to know these things, and retirement, and you need to know about them. And we will fill you in, clue you in, let you know what's going on. What a wonderful day this has been. I hope you catch this in reruns and tell your friends, tell your family, everybody watch, and go to axmediagroup.com. Press the donate button. Nancy and I don't get that, but I'll tell you what, this operation gets it to help take this message all the way around the world, and it's doing it. What a great thing it is. Well, because of that, I will tell you this, you can cast all your care upon him because he cares about you. I'm talking about Jesus.
I know, that's right. Oh, doggies.
So therefore, you stay blessed.